Chris, welcome back to Australia.
Thanks, Rob.
Great to have you here. The Indo Pacific region is going through one of its most consequential changes since arguably the end of the Second World War. In response to that, the recently announced AUKUS pact between the United States, Australia and the UK was set forth. Perhaps spend a moment reflecting on the changes that Australia should think about in both their cyber defence and cyber resilience based on those events.
Sure. I think when you look at any pact like that, it brings about interest. For example, when we see anything like that occur, you'll see that there's going to be nations or even activist groups that are going to take interest in that position, whether it is for it or against it. And so as a result, you're going to see typically increased both kind of e-crime attacks as well as nation state attacks. And they're going to look and see a couple things. One, can they exploit that for purposes of trying to express their discontent with the arrangement, as well as can they exploit that for the purposes of trying to gain an understanding of maybe the technology that could be conveyed. If there's interesting intellectual property, trade secrets that they might be able to exploit for either purposes of espionage and getting ahead of that technology, as well as potentially using that information for purposes of developing countermeasures. So you have kind of both a cyber nexus as well as a physical nexus.
And you have spoken previously about the uplift in cyber awareness and the requirement for better cyber defence through the supply chain. The AUKUS agreement and the AUKUS pact is one such example where supply chain risk raises exponentially, particularly when you start talking about sensitive technologies. Perhaps reflect on what organisations should start thinking about now to prepare for that new threat landscape.
Sure. So when you look at the supply chain, that's critically important. You know, most of the organizations that I talk to today, they don't do everything themselves. They have a critical kind of core piece to their business, and then they have a whole host of suppliers that they rely on to make everything else work. And one of the things that I see maybe a little bit lacking or areas where there could be improvement is the opportunity to really review who those suppliers are, the role that they play in your organization, whether it's your applications, your data, your systems, your intellectual property. And typically what my recommendation would be is, you know, stack rank those organizations based on what kind of exposure that might bring to you if that organization were to have some kind of incident or if they were to be attacked in some way. And then how would you apply either security controls or do any type of enhanced validation or due diligence, for example, to ensure that they're meeting the level of security that you'd like.
Great, thank you. Countries across the Asia Pacific region have varied and very different approaches to cyber resilience. For instance, here in Australia, the government adopts a very user-centric approach to their cybersecurity policy and resilience. What lessons can Australia and other countries in the Asia Pacific region learn from the United States and perhaps the EU in this regard?
Sure. I think probably one of the key things that everyone can take away from all of those kind of arrangements is the importance of collaboration. What we find is most organizations, I mean, really, frankly, any organization, they can't do it alone, whether it's an individual business, agency, or even a country at a larger level. They need to collaborate with others because at the end of the day, someone may have insights, visibility, or intelligence into a specific threat that maybe one of their allies or partners doesn't. Being able to share that on a kind of global basis or across your partner organizations or countries is critically important to you being able to succeed.
Great, thank you. Chris, you've worked with boards and CEOs across the world, both in planning for and responding to large-scale cyber incidents. What should CEOs and boards be thinking about today as they assess these new threats and risks in the Asia Pacific region and contemplate what a more unstable geopolitical environment looks like into the future?
Sure. So I think at the end of the day, CEOs need to be more plugged into what it looks like when an incident occurs. Historically, when we've seen incidents, it's largely been managed by the CISO and maybe even levels below them. It's important now, especially as the incidents get larger, ransomware events get bigger, the demands on the organization are increasing, and the need for the CEO or at that level to be plugged in is critically important. And they need to be able to know what that experience is like, because the timelines for these events are also speeding up. You know, when we used to see breaches years ago, they would take place over weeks, months, maybe even longer, and there was often a lot of time to contemplate what your actions might be. Nowadays, what we find is those events are taking place over hours to days, and so the need for the C-suite and the CEO in particular to understand the ramifications of that and how they're going to respond, kind of build that muscle memory of what that response would look like, is critically important. And then also what we find is there's increasing interest from a regulatory and legal standpoint to actually place liability at the C-suite level based on how an organization either reacts or doesn't react properly. So I think it's in their own best interest as well, just to raise their awareness.
And what questions should they be asking directly of their CIO and CISO right now to help give them that awareness and that comfort?
I think they should all be asking to actually go through and exercise themselves and say, show me what we would do in the event of one of these attacks. Don't just come to me when the attack occurs and try to walk me through it, but actually let's practice. Let's go through some kind of simulation to see what that would be like, because I think there's no better way to understand what that event will be like than to go through a simulated version of it yourself.
Great. You had spoken previously about the rise of ransomware as an attack vector, particularly in reference to Verizon's data breach investigation report, where originally we saw very small amounts, but we've seen a rapid escalation in more recent times. Perhaps reflect on some of the trends and the occurrences that have caused that rapid increase, and then cast forward and think about the emerging threats that you worry about, that you think about, that organizations might need to start preparing for.
Sure. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. When we first started looking at ransomware in the early days, it rarely even kind of registered on our radar. It was relatively small, but one of the things we said in that early DBIR was, if organizations actually start paying that ransom, we expect that it's going to increase, and it's going to embolden the threat actors to do it more, because most of them are out to ultimately get paid. And so that's exactly what happened. We saw the ransomware events increase. We saw also the demands that they were asking for were increasing. It started with maybe hundreds or thousands of dollars to now being well in the excess of tens of millions, or we've already starting to see, $100+ million ransom demand. So the monetary component of that has consistently increased. The other thing that I would also say is that the nature and the way that they are positioning their leverage has also changed. In the beginning, ransomware was all about locking up your system so you couldn't use it. Organizations found ways around that, and they improved their backup strategies. Then they went forward, the ransomware actors deployed the ransomware, and they stole your data. So now they had a way to monetize that data if an organization didn't pay the ransom. And then kind of the third, I kind of say it's the ransomware 1, 2, 3. The third is now they actually will take the data, and if you don't pay, they will mine through that data, look to see if they can find other people's information in there, and then approach them and say, hey, I've uncovered this data about you, and using that as another potential method of extorting some form of ransom payment. To your second part of your question around, kind of where I might see this going, the evolution of it further, the concern I have is that the potential for ransomware to be deployed to other technologies, in particular things like operational technologies. Could you imagine if ransomware was deployed to the electric grid, and now you could hold an entire neighborhood, city, or state hostage until ransom was paid? You could extort an organization for a tremendous sum in a situation like that. And obviously, there's also life and death components to that, right? Me losing power so that I can't charge my phone, probably not all that critical. A hospital losing power for an extended period of time, you actually have real life and death consequences to that. Or, police or fire or other critical infrastructure, there's substantial impacts there.
Following on from that, you had spoken previously also about the extension of cyber threats into operational technology, the systems and controls that operate buildings, infrastructure, that perhaps in some cases aren't as sophisticated and well maintained as traditional corporate systems. And you've identified that there's a particular threat there and possibly a very large vulnerability. Can you talk a little bit about how organizations should think about that as they contemplate capital investment to upgrade their infrastructure today?
Sure. Yeah, it's another one that's critically important. In fact, it's interesting. I was talking with it was a large-scale bank, and we were talking about how they were looking at their security. And one of their people pulled me aside and said, you know what? One of the things that we're really concerned about, but we haven't really looked at, was our data centers, but not in the way you think. they were concerned about the facilities management systems that actually keep those buildings operating. Because they said, look, maybe you can't attack our systems directly, you can't steal our data directly, but if you could impact the systems that run the cooling, the data centers will shut down because they'll overheat and the systems will just all start shutting off. So he said there's an impact there that people don't think of that has a cyber component, but it's not a data theft, data security, it's just an availability kind of issue. So we see a lot of things like that, and I encourage organizations to look back on a lot of their kind of legacy and older technology, because there's a lot out there now, especially where organizations are taking technology that might be 10, 20, 30 plus years old that didn't even know what the internet was when that technology came about. And now people are connecting that technology to the internet because it facilitates metrics gathering, or for example, in the course of the pandemic, lots of organizations moved technology to being internet connected because their employees were now all working remote. And so they had to find a way to have their employees access those systems. So now those facility management systems that the world never had connected to the internet are now all connected to the internet. And so there's a lot of risk there. You know, imagine if you were able to, you know, impact not just the HVAC, but also say the fire suppression systems or other things like that. There's a real significant concern there.
Great. Chris, with the advent of new ways to connect, both for citizens, governments and enterprises, technology such as 5G becoming pervasive across communities, cities and towns, we see a change in the way people think about their data, how it moves across devices and across networks, and therefore consequentially, citizens in particular think very differently about their own data security and their own online identity. It feels like we have to bridge a gap between what consumers and citizens think and know or understand about security, and what governments and enterprises need to know and think about in order to protect that citizen's information. Reflect a little bit on where we are, how big that gap is.
Sure.
And what can governments and enterprises do to help better educate, inform, and therefore close that security gap?
Yeah, you make a great point there, because one of the things that I've often said is that, you know, security can't be left to just the security people, which may sound funny to some people, but the reality of it is the security challenge is much bigger than what the security people alone can handle. For example, when we do incident response, a lot of times it may be someone who's not in security that actually sees the first initial suspicious thing and reports it, and then security then investigates it from there. So it's important to have everybody plugged in, and that really starts with the user education and awareness. It's what kind of campaigns are out there, and then also how often do you refresh and reiterate that, and then also how do you keep that current with the changing threat landscape, because we can't be just continuing to refresh the same education on cyber threats from 5 years ago when the landscape has moved past that and the actors are doing something different, right? So it's important that we continue that education, and I also think that needs to be brought down into, you know, from an age perspective. I think we often think of cybersecurity as, you know, what is it that professionals can do in the work environment, but I think honestly you start preparing people even younger and you say, look, let's start talking about cybersecurity to children in school. They have many online accounts, you know, at earlier ages than a lot of adults probably had at that time. And they have data out there in ways that many of us probably never did at that age. You know, learning that young will hopefully empower them to do a better job of securing their data as they go forward, and also potentially influence things like the regulatory and legal landscape going forward.
Great, thank you. And finally, Chris, a question on critical infrastructure. Here in Australia, the government has recently reflected on and expanded its view of the classification of critical infrastructure to things that traditionally hadn't necessarily been considered as such. Payment systems, data center and co-location infrastructure, other parts of electrical grids and other parts of critical infrastructure that provide services to our citizenry and towns. When you think about security and cybersecurity in particular, how do you think about its relationship to critical infrastructure? Where does it start and end? And what should governments be thinking about when they contemplate what seems a really significant task, which is to protect the entire infrastructure of a country from attack?
Sure, that's a very big question. So I would say that tends to really look at it from a start and end perspective of what is going to have the most substantial impact to national security, and the ongoing operations of the country, right? And I think that's going to be different based on how different countries operate and where, say, the predominance of, say, their GDP comes from. You know, what is it that they are most heavily invested in and see as their future growth? And then how do they tailor, you know, their approach to security to ensure that they've got, you know, appropriate defenses of that. I think it makes sense when you look at things like payment infrastructure, because so much of the world has moved from being more cash-based to being more, you know, electronic-based. So that becomes a more critical component of how we operate as a, you know, an economy, for example. And I think, you know, all the rest of things like communications infrastructure, so much more of that is happening digitally that we need to be focusing on how we protect that as well. And then also, you know, you get out there into, you know, energy, utilities, healthcare, manufacturing, all of these start to become more and more intertwined, and it almost gets difficult to find a place where you can say that's not important or not as important. But I think, you know, ultimately it's that kind of risk rating again.
Yeah, wonderful. Chris, it's been a great pleasure speaking with you. Thanks for joining me.
Yep, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.